Poppy David, Chili. Baby, sit down for this one, because what unfolded inside that Los Angeles courtroom during day 2 of the David Anthony Burke preliminary hearing is not the kind of thing you casually scroll past. This isn't a rumor. This isn't a whisper from a random gossip page. This is prosecutors, forensic investigators, and financial executives all lining up under oath, one after another, to lay pieces of a case on the record that a lot of David's fans, and a lot of the industry, were praying would never see the light of day. And baby, the light hit hard. Y'all, this one's about to detonate, and here's why. The singer David Anthony Burke, better known to the internet as D4VD, is facing charges connected to the death and dismemberment of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez, whose remains were discovered inside the front trunk of a Tesla registered to David at a Hollywood tow yard. That is where this story begins. That is what day 2 of the preliminary hearing was built around. And by the time court adjourned, the prosecution had walked in with a stack of forensic findings, financial records, and witness testimony so pointed that the courtroom felt less like a hearing and more like a slow, methodical closing of doors around David Anthony Burke. Now, before we go 1 inch further, let me back up for a second, because context matters and everybody with 2 eyes needs to understand exactly what this proceeding is and what it isn't. A preliminary hearing is not a trial. Judge Charlene Olmedo, presiding over the case, is not deciding at this stage whether David Anthony Burke is guilty or innocent. The bar is lower, but the stakes are enormous. The prosecution only needs to establish probable cause, enough evidence for the judge to determine that the case should move forward. And even at that lower bar, mark my words, what emerged in court on day 2 has already reframed how the public views David Anthony Burke and the singer once known worldwide as D4VD. The centerpiece of the day was the Tesla. That vehicle, registered to David Anthony Burke, is now the single most important piece of physical evidence prosecutors have introduced. According to sworn testimony, Celeste Rivas Hernandez remains were discovered inside the front trunk of that Tesla on September 8, 2025, while the vehicle sat at a Hollywood tow yard after being ticketed and impounded. The story of how the Tesla ended up in that tow yard is its own thread. Investigators testified the car had been left abandoned on a Hollywood Hills street, sat long enough to accumulate tickets, and was ultimately towed on September 5. 3 days later, tow yard workers noticed an odor no one could ignore, and once they alerted authorities, the entire architecture of this case began to unfold. A forensic criminalist took the stand and walked the court through what investigators encountered inside that Tesla, and baby, the details are the kind that make even seasoned court reporters exhale. There was a strong odor consistent with human decomposition. There was extensive insect activity concentrated in the front trunk. Both findings, the criminalist testified, are consistent with remains being contained inside an enclosed compartment for a significant length of time. Not days. Not weeks. Prosecutors have anchored their timeline to a much longer window. They identify April 23, 2025 as the last date Celeste Rivas Hernandez was confirmed to be present, which means roughly 4.5 months separate that point from the September discovery. That is the yawning gap prosecutors want the judge to consider, and every piece of evidence they introduced on day 2 was designed to fit inside it. Whispers around the case say the front trunk of that Tesla is going to be the single most photographed vehicle compartment in modern American celebrity crime coverage, and the reason is what investigators say they documented inside it. Celeste's remains, according to Detective Joshua Byers, one of the first investigators to respond, had been placed in separate bags. Sit with that sentence for a moment. Separate bags. Not a phrase you forget once you've heard it. Detective Byers testified about the condition of what was recovered and about the sequence of events that led investigators from a routine tow yard call to a full homicide investigation targeting a Grammy-adjacent chart-topping singer. And think about the human sequence of what actually happened at that Hollywood tow yard, because it is almost accidental in its origin. The Tesla was not pulled over. The Tesla was not raided. The Tesla was not staked out by law enforcement acting on a tip. The Tesla was ticketed. It was towed. It sat. And the discovery of what was inside came only because ordinary tow yard workers, doing an ordinary shift, could not ignore an odor that no professional detailer could explain. That is the origin story of this entire investigation into David Anthony Burke. Not a raid. Not a stakeout. A ticket, a tow, a smell, a phone call. From that phone call, everything else flowed. Every subsequent detail introduced on day 2 ultimately traces back to that single, almost cinematic accident of civic protocol. And here is a detail that deserves to be surfaced. The Tesla was left on a Hollywood Hills street, not in a private garage, not in a secured lot, but on the public roadway, exposed to the ordinary rhythm of parking enforcement. Prosecutors will argue that decision invites a specific interpretation. The defense will argue the opposite. Both readings are on the table. Neither has been proven. But the placement of that Tesla will be revisited by both sides as this hearing continues. But the Tesla was only the beginning. Because once forensic teams stepped back, one specific detail leaped forward and refused to be ignored. Air fresheners. At least 11 of them recovered from different areas inside that Tesla. Most were reportedly stacked inside the center console. Others turned up near the rear seating area. Some were located inside that same front trunk. On their own, air fresheners prove nothing. Anybody can drive around with a strong scent in their car. But prosecutors argue the number and the distribution are what matter. 11 air fresheners, in specific locations, alongside a documented odor consistent with decomposition, alongside insect activity in the enclosed compartment where Celeste Rivas Hernandez was ultimately found, form a pattern the prosecution says is worth examining closely. The testimony did not establish who placed them there or when. That is where the defense will keep pushing. But the sheer volume of them, catalogued and photographed, is now permanently in the record. Then came the finding that could shift the courtroom's center of gravity. Investigators documented a possible blood reaction near the Tesla's rear seats. And this is where the case sharpens into a debate about what forensic evidence actually means. The initial test was presumptive. In plain language, a presumptive test can suggest the possible presence of blood, but it cannot confirm blood on its own. The criminalist agreed with that framing on cross-examination. And this is exactly where the defense, led by Blair Burke, has been surgical. Blair Burke has been zeroing in on every single point where the prosecution's forensic evidence begins with a presumptive result rather than a laboratory confirmation. The defense is not necessarily saying these findings don't exist. The defense is saying, prove they mean what you claim they mean. And that distinction is going to matter enormously if this case advances to trial. Now let's get to the location that arguably terrifies David Anthony Burke's defense team the most. Because after the Tesla, attention pivoted to David's Hollywood Hills rental property, specifically the garage. Investigators conducted an extensive forensic examination of that garage using a chemical called Bluestar. For anyone unfamiliar, Bluestar can reveal possible traces of blood that are no longer visible to the naked eye by producing a luminescent reaction associated with hemoglobin. Again, and this cannot be repeated enough, a Bluestar reaction alone does not automatically confirm blood. It flags a location for further testing. But the number of Bluestar reactions documented inside that garage is where the prosecution's argument gains real weight. Investigators testified they observed Bluestar reactions on black rubber floor mats. They observed reactions on the brick flooring underneath those mats. Read that again. Underneath. Which raises the question of whether liquid material may have seeped through the mats and reached the brick below. Investigators also documented preliminary positive reactions on a rowing machine, on a folded green tarp, and on several brown-stained wipes recovered from a black trash bag. Sources close to the case are telling us that when prosecutors lined these individual findings up back to back to back, they read like a checklist, and that is by design. The prosecution is not asking the judge to look at any single reaction. The prosecution is asking the judge to look at all of them together. Then, just when it seemed the garage couldn't produce anything more surreal, investigators unrolled an inflatable blue pool recovered from the property. And what they described next made the courtroom pause. The forensic specialist testified the pool carried what she called an unusually fresh laundry scent, with several dryer sheets reportedly attached to it. Nothing about that combination sounds normal. Not the freshness. Not the dryer sheets. Not the pool itself. No blood was visibly apparent on it before chemical testing. But once investigators applied Bluestar, one section produced a reaction. Again, a Bluestar reaction is not final confirmation. But when you place a possible reaction next to an unusually fresh laundry scent next to attached dryer sheets, prosecutors argue you're looking at a scene consistent with prior cleaning. The defense, of course, has every right to challenge what those individual details actually prove, and Blair Burke has been doing exactly that. And then came the detail that may be the single most damaging piece of physical evidence introduced so far. Prosecutors allege that blue fragments recovered along with Celeste Rivas Hernandez remains physically fit missing sections of that damaged inflatable pool. Sliced right at the artery. If that alleged physical fit holds up under trial-level scrutiny, it draws a direct line from the pool inside David's garage to the remains inside David's Tesla. That is not a symbolic connection. That is a physical one. And that is the connection prosecutors are asking Judge Charlene Olmedo to weigh when she considers whether probable cause has been met. Now, everybody with two eyes knows that a case built on the Tesla and the garage alone would already be heavy. But Day 2 added an entirely different geographic thread, and the courtroom felt it. Celeste Rivas Hernandez United States passport card. A California Department of Transportation worker discovered that passport card in January 2026 in a brush-covered area near State Route 154, also known as San Marcos Pass Road, near Lake Cachuma in Santa Barbara County. A California Highway Patrol officer testified he collected the card from the Caltrans worker and entered it into evidence. When the passport card was displayed in the courtroom, its photograph showed Celeste Rivas Hernandez as she appeared when the card was issued in May 2022. According to public reporting, that image triggered a visible emotional response from a family member sitting in the courtroom. A heavy, human moment inside a proceeding otherwise dominated by timelines, chemical reactions, and dollar figures. But where that passport card was found is not incidental. It is central. Court filings describe 3 separate trips linked to the State Route 154 area. The first allegedly occurred late on April 23, 2025, shortly after the exact point prosecutors identify as the moment Celeste was last known to be present. 2 additional visits were documented on May 8 and May 31. Prosecutors also introduced location data that they maintain places David Anthony Burke near the same area where Celeste's passport card was eventually recovered by that Caltrans worker. Now, the presence of the passport card near that highway does not, by itself, establish who left it there or how it arrived. But prosecutors are threading 3 alleged trips, corroborating location data, and the discovery of Celeste's official identification in the same broad geographic corridor into a single argument. Word from around the courthouse says the Santa Barbara thread may prove more decisive than anyone expected, because unlike a single forensic test that can be challenged as presumptive, geographic patterns are cumulative. Every trip is another data point. Every data point is another sentence in the prosecution's closing argument if this case goes to trial. Then Day 2 returned to something the internet has been debating since the moment this case broke. The text messages. Prosecutors allege David Anthony Burke sent messages on the night of April 23, 2025, from the Hollywood Hills area, asking Celeste Rivas Hernandez, "Where are you?" While prosecutors allege that at the exact moment those messages were sent, Celeste was already at David's residence. The prosecution's theory is that these messages were deliberately crafted to fabricate a misleading digital record, one that would suggest David did not know where Celeste was on the night in question. That remains a prosecution allegation. It is not established fact. But it has resurfaced through court filings and re-entered the Day 2 record, and mark my words, that alleged digital deception is going to be one of the most argued pieces of evidence if this case goes the distance. Anyway, from digital evidence, the hearing pivoted hard into an entirely different kind of proof. Money. And the numbers, y'all, are staggering. Louis Poyagiagis, a senior finance executive at Interscope Records, took the stand and confirmed under oath that David Anthony Burke and his associated companies received approximately $3.9 million in payments during 2023, followed by another $2.3 million in 2025. Between 2023 and 2025, the executive testified, David Anthony Burke's music career generated more than $10 million at its peak. Poyagiagis further testified that David's agreement with the label ended at the close of 2025, and that no additional label payments have been issued in 2026. Why does this matter? Because the prosecution is arguing a financial gain special circumstance. In plain language, they are alleging David Anthony Burke had a powerful, measurable, dollar-denominated reason to prevent his alleged relationship with a 14-year-old girl from becoming public. His debut album Withered had recently been released. A world tour was reportedly being assembled. Millions were on the table. If the public learned that a chart-topping singer had been in a sustained relationship with a minor, that career trajectory doesn't just wobble, it evaporates overnight. Poured gasoline on a house already burning, some observers said. Now the money by itself does not prove motive. Motive has to be inferred from the financial reality alongside every other event the prosecution has alleged. But this is the first time the courtroom has heard specific dollar figures. $10 million. 3.9. 2.3. Numbers create anchors. And these anchors are now permanently attached to the prosecution's narrative about David Anthony Burke. Then attention shifted to a witness whose testimony has the potential to reshape everything the public thinks it knew about David Anthony Burke's professional world. Benjamin Greger, who handled financial matters connected to David's career, took the stand. And what Greger confirmed under oath was narrow but significant. Greger testified that he was familiar with Celeste Rivas Hernandez's first name before this investigation ever became public. He testified he had heard her name from David's manager, Robert Morgan Roth. He testified he was aware of a trip to London involving David Anthony Burke and Celeste. Now let's talk about why that testimony aimed straight for the soft spot. Because it directly contradicts the account David Anthony Burke reportedly gave law enforcement in February 2024, when he told deputies he had only met Celeste one time. One time. That is the story David told. But Greger's testimony indicates that people inside David Anthony Burke's professional circle knew Celeste's first name, knew about international travel connected to her, and knew enough that her name was already circulating within David's inner professional world well before any of this became a headline. That is not a peripheral inconsistency. That is a direct clash between David Anthony Burke's own reported statement and sworn testimony from someone inside his professional camp. Prosecutors then tried to push Greger further, and this is where the courtroom drama sharpened into something almost theatrical. The prosecution attempted to establish whether Robert Morgan Roth had ever referred to Celeste as David Anthony Burke's girlfriend. The defense objected. Judge Charlene Olmedo sustained the objection. Which means the court never heard Greger's answer to that question, and no conclusion can fairly be drawn about what he would have said. Then prosecutors pushed on an alleged Texas trip, on whether Celeste had ever met members of David's family, and on whether fake identification had allegedly been used during travel. The defense objected. The objection stacked. Ultimately, the judge shut down that entire line of questioning. Bullseye painted on that line of testimony, and the defense hit it. Whether prosecutors can establish any of those additional claims through other witnesses or through documentary evidence remains an open question. Until that happens, those specific characterizations should be treated as allegations that Greger did not confirm on the record. But what Greger did confirm is enough on its own. He confirmed that David Anthony Burke's own manager was talking about Celeste. He confirmed that a London trip involving David Anthony Burke and Celeste was known within the professional camp. And he placed those confirmations directly against David Anthony Burke's own reported claim of having met her only once. Sources close to the case are telling us that Greger's testimony, narrow as it may have been, is the kind of testimony that keeps prosecutors awake at night in a good way. Because it is the beginning of a much larger question that Day 2 only started to explore: how many people inside David Anthony Burke's professional world knew about Celeste, and what exactly did they know? Every remaining witness prosecutors call is going to be measured against Greger. Every future document introduced is going to be measured against Greger. If prosecutors can build a chain of people inside David Anthony Burke's professional camp who knew Celeste's name, knew about the travel, knew about the alleged relationship, the "met her once" account becomes untenable. And that unraveling would happen in front of a jury, if this case reaches one. By the time court adjourned on Day 2, prosecutors had woven several distinct threads into one connected chronology. The Tesla and its forensic condition. The garage and its Bluestar reactions. The inflatable pool with its unusually fresh laundry scent and the alleged physical fit between its fragments and the remains. The passport card discovered in Santa Barbara County. The location data. The 3 alleged trips. The alleged text messages from April 23. The $10 million career. The financial gain special circumstance. And the professional circle testimony from Benjamin Greger. That is not a case built on a single smoking gun. That is a case built on the accumulation of evidence across categories that would each independently be significant, and that prosecutors say are staggering when combined. Now let me be clear about one thing. David Anthony Burke has pleaded not guilty to all charges. He remains presumed innocent unless and until the legal process establishes otherwise. That legal presumption is not a technicality. It is the backbone of due process. And the defense has been operating on that backbone with real precision. Blair Burke and the defense team have used cross-examination not to deny that findings were documented but to challenge exactly how much weight prosecutors can reasonably place on them. Which forensic tests were presumptive versus confirmed? Which locations were subjected to follow-up laboratory testing? Which items can and cannot be conclusively tied to a specific person or event? Which witnesses were speaking from direct knowledge versus second-hand awareness? Those are the pressure points the defense is building on. And in a trial, those pressure points can matter enormously. That is the legal showdown taking shape through this hearing. Prosecutors are stacking independent categories of evidence and asking Judge Charlene Olmedo to view them as a connected body. The defense is testing every connection and putting every gap directly onto the court record. Judge Charlene Olmedo will ultimately determine whether the probable cause threshold has been met. And that determination will decide whether David Anthony Burke faces a jury. But even beyond the courtroom mechanics, Day 2 produced moments that will echo far outside the legal filings. The image of Celeste Rivas Hernandez's passport card being displayed in open court. The emotional reaction from her family member in the gallery. The methodical description of the Tesla's front trunk. The forensic breakdown of the garage. The specific dollar figures attached to David Anthony Burke's career. The clash between what David reportedly told police in 2024 and what Greger testified in 2026. These are the details that will define public memory of this proceeding, whatever the judge ultimately decides. Let me back up one more time, because the pool detail deserves a second look. An inflatable blue pool, inside a garage, unrolled during a forensic examination, described by a specialist as carrying an unusually fresh laundry scent, with several dryer sheets attached, and producing a Bluestar reaction in one section despite showing no visible blood before chemical testing. Read that sentence twice. Because the reason prosecutors are anchoring so much of their case to that pool is not the pool itself. It is the alleged fit between the recovered fragments and the pool sections. If that fit holds, it is not a coincidence. It is not a similarity. It is a physical mating of two objects that prosecutors say tells the court exactly where at least part of the alleged crime scene was assembled. That alleged fit, combined with the Bluestar reactions, combined with the fresh laundry scent, combined with the dryer sheets, forms the single most vivid picture prosecutors have painted so far. And they painted it on Day 2. Everybody with two eyes knows that celebrity cases live and die on public perception long before they reach a jury. David Anthony Burke rose from viral bedroom-produced songs to headlining international festivals inside 3 years. The name D4VD became shorthand for a specific brand of moody, cinematic, teenage heartbreak pop that ricocheted across social platforms. Sync deals. Playlist domination. A tour architecture. Interscope investment. Millions in earnings, confirmed under oath by an executive on the stand. That is the world David Anthony Burke was operating in during the exact months prosecutors say he was allegedly concealing what had happened to Celeste Rivas Hernandez. The dissonance between the public persona and the alleged private conduct is the thing that has made this case ricochet the way it has. And here is what makes Day 2 land differently than Day 1. On Day 1, prosecutors introduced the arrest, the initial discovery, the digital messages, the early scene descriptions. Day 1 was the trailer. Day 2 was the film. Day 2 was where the prosecution walked the courtroom through evidence categories methodically, one after another, and gave each one its own weight before layering it on top of the next. Detective Byers on the recovery of the remains. The forensic criminalist on the Tesla examination. The specialist on the garage and the pool. The highway patrol officer on the passport card. The Interscope executive on the $10 million career. Benjamin Greger on the professional circle awareness of Celeste. Piece by piece by piece. That is what a prosecution looks like when it believes the evidence is on its side. Now the defense sees the same evidence and reaches a very different conclusion. The defense sees a case that leans heavily on presumptive forensic results without always establishing which of those results were confirmed by laboratory testing. The defense sees geographic thread arguments built on location data that will require chain of custody scrutiny. The defense sees text message allegations that the prosecution characterizes but that the jury, if this reaches one, will need to interpret independently. The defense sees financial evidence that establishes career value but does not by itself prove motive. And the defense sees a Benjamin Greger whose second-hand knowledge, while damaging, was successfully limited by sustained objections when it drifted toward specifics. The gap between those two readings is the gap this hearing will decide. Judge Charlene Olmedo has to determine whether the connected body of evidence prosecutors have introduced is sufficient to meet the probable cause standard. It is a lower standard than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It is not the trial standard. But it is not automatic either. And prosecutors have clearly built day 2 with that standard front of mind. Because every piece of evidence they walked into the courtroom on day 2 is designed to reinforce the same argument, that across 4.5 months, from April 23, 2025 to September 8, 2025, a documented pattern of concealment allegedly took place, and that David Anthony Burke was allegedly at the center of that pattern. If probable cause is established, this case moves toward trial. If it is not, the charges could be dismissed either in whole or in part. The consequences for David Anthony Burke, either way, are life-altering. And that is why the courtroom on day 2 felt so heavy. Because everyone in that room understood that what was unfolding was not just a preliminary hearing. It was the first full public accounting of what prosecutors say happened, in the words of the investigators who documented it, under the constraints of sworn testimony, in front of a judge whose ruling will shape the next chapter of this case. And here is the piece that lingers. Celeste Rivas Hernandez was 14 years old. Her passport card, issued in May 2022, showed her as a child. That is the image that was displayed in the courtroom. That is the image that produced a visible emotional response from her family. That is the image that reminds everyone watching this case, from a distance, that behind every forensic report, every dollar figure, every dryer sheet, every Bluestar reaction, every text message allegation, every trip to State Route 154, there is a 14-year-old girl whose family sat in that courtroom, listening. Listening while investigators described the front trunk of a Tesla. Listening while a specialist described an inflatable pool. Listening while dollar figures for a music career were read aloud. Listening. And think about what listening actually costs, in a room like that, with cameras outside, with reporters filing dispatches by the minute, with strangers on social media dissecting every frame of the family's grief in real time. Every witness who took the stand on day 2 of the David Anthony Burke preliminary hearing spoke into a room where Celeste Rivas Hernandez people were seated within arm's reach of the very evidence being described. That is not incidental context. That is the human atmosphere in which Judge Charlene Olmedo will ultimately have to rule. The forensic record is one layer. The emotional record is another. Both are now permanently attached to this proceeding. Word from around the courthouse says the moment that passport card was displayed, observers noted a stillness court reporters rarely see. Preliminary hearings are procedural. They tend to be dry, dominated by chain of custody minutiae. But that passport card cut through the procedure and reminded everyone that this case has a name, a face, a birth date, a family. And that family sat in the gallery on day 2 of the David Anthony Burke preliminary hearing, watching a photograph of their child introduced as an exhibit. David Anthony Burke has pleaded not guilty. That legal reality remains. But the emotional reality of day 2 is that prosecutors have now made it exceptionally difficult for the public to look away from the details they placed on the record. The air fresheners. The insect activity. The dryer sheets. The pool fragments. The passport in the brush. The $10 million. The London trip Gregor knew about. The one-time meeting David told police about. Everything now sits on the record, side by side, waiting for Judge Charlene Olmedo to decide what happens next. Mark my words, whichever way this hearing ends, day 2 is the moment this case stopped being a rumor cycle and started being a documented courtroom event. Because the difference between headlines and testimony is enormous. Headlines can be denied. Testimony under oath, subject to cross-examination, entered into the official court record, carries a different weight entirely. And prosecutors filled the record on day 2. So here is where you come in. Because a case like this is not decided on a YouTube channel, but the conversation absolutely lives here. And that conversation matters. Should Judge Charlene Olmedo send this case to trial on the strength of the evidence introduced across days 1 and 2, treating the accumulation as sufficient probable cause? Or is the defense right that too much of the forensic material lives in the presumptive gray zone, meaning the judge should demand tighter, laboratory-confirmed evidence before a full trial is triggered? Both answers can be argued honestly. Both answers have real courtroom weight. And ultimately, only one person, the presiding judge, will make the final call. But before she does, let me ask you directly. When you look at the totality of what came out on day 2 of the David Anthony Burke preliminary hearing, the Tesla, the garage, the pool, the passport card, the location data, the alleged text messages, the $10 million career, and the professional circle testimony from Benjamin Greger, do you see a case that has already earned its way to a jury? Or do you see a case that still has too many presumptive edges to justify the highest stakes courtroom process in the American legal system? Drop your verdict down below. Tell me which way you're leaning and why. And more importantly, tell me what you think the next witness prosecutor's call is going to bring, because we are not done. This preliminary hearing has more testimony ahead, and every witness is going to matter. Sources close to the case are telling us that additional forensic testimony is expected, that additional financial documentation may be introduced, and that the defense is preparing a cross-examination strategy specifically calibrated to the confirmed versus presumptive distinction. If any of those threads produces the kind of moment they too produced, the public perception of David Anthony Burke will shift again. This is a case that is still writing itself, chapter by chapter, in real time. And unlike the headlines racing across social media, the courtroom record is permanent. Whatever is entered there, stays there. Let me lay out one more angle that has quietly slipped underneath the louder headlines, because it may end up mattering more than people realize. The Interscope testimony from Luis Poyagiages did not just introduce dollar figures. It introduced a specific career timeline, and that timeline overlaps almost perfectly with the prosecution's theory of the case. Debut album withered. Rising tour infrastructure. Peak label investment during 2023 and 2025. And then a sudden termination of the label agreement at the close of 2025, precisely months after Celeste Rivas Hernandez remains were recovered from that Tesla in September of 2025. Prosecutors did not spell out that overlay in explicit language on day 2. They did not need to. Because the timeline they walked into that courtroom does the work all by itself, and everybody with two eyes in that gallery could see the shape of it. Whispers around the case say the label side of this story is only beginning to be told, and that additional financial witnesses may be called to establish exactly what David Anthony Burke's professional world understood about his personal circumstances and when. Every executive at every level of the machinery behind D4VD is now a potential subject of subpoena. Every accountant. Every attorney. Every publicist. Every manager. Every A&R contact who touched a contract, a royalty statement, a tour ledger, or a travel booking during the relevant window is theoretically a witness the prosecution could call. Whether they do, and whether the judge permits it, remains to be seen. But the door has been opened. And once a door like that opens in a courtroom, it rarely closes quietly. And then there is the Santa Barbara corridor, which deserves one more careful pass. State Route 154 is not a random highway. It is a scenic mountain pass that connects Santa Barbara to the Santa Ynez Valley, curving through terrain that offers ample opportunity for a driver to stop, exit, and dispose of items in brush-covered areas without immediate observation. That is not conjecture. That is geography. And prosecutors are asking Judge Charlene Olmedo to consider that geography alongside the alleged location data placing David Anthony Burke in the vicinity during 3 separate trips. If the location data is authenticated and the chain of custody survives cross-examination, that geographic pattern becomes one of the strongest circumstantial pillars of the prosecution's overall theory. If any of those authentications falters, the pillar weakens. That is it. So stay locked in. Because as day 3, day 4, and every subsequent day of this preliminary hearing unfolds, the record is going to grow. Judge Charlene Olmedo will weigh what she has been shown. The defense will keep pressing every gap. Prosecutors will keep stacking every category. And at some point, a ruling on probable cause will land, and the direction of David Anthony Burke's future will be set in motion. Whichever direction that is, we will be here breaking it down the moment it happens. If you want to be here for it too, make sure you are subscribed and that notifications are turned on, because the next courtroom day is going to matter as much as this one did. Maybe more. Whispers around the case say the biggest surprise is still ahead. Whether that is true or not, we will find out together. Drop your verdict below, and let's meet back here the moment day 3 drops.